They laughed when she said her father was coming. A scared 16-year-old girl, handcuffed in a dingy station, whispering that her dad was in special forces. Sure he is, the cop smirked. Hours later, that same officer stood frozen as a man in a faded combat jacket walked through the front doors. No backup, no warrant, just purpose. What would you do if the man you mocked trained to take down warlords, and now he was here for you? The summer heat had thickened the air over the small town of Crescent Hill, where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen, at least, not in the open. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Officer Rick Granger, a cocky 30-something with mirrored sunglasses and a sarcasm addiction, sat in his cruiser beside the town gas station, bored and fidgety. That's when he saw her, Amora Brooks, 16, walking alone with a bag of art supplies and a soda. Her skin color alone made her an anomaly in this nearly all-white town, but Rick had always had a sixth sense for suspicious behavior, and today, that sixth sense smelled trouble. His partner, Officer Kyle Denton, barely looked up from his phone as Rick stepped out of the cruiser, pulling on his gloves like he was preparing for a raid instead of a stroll. He approached Amora with the swagger of someone who thought their badge made them invincible. Amora had barely looked up before Rick barked, "Hey, what's in the bag?" His tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory. She froze, startled, but politely held it open to show her sketchbooks, pencils, and a bottle of iced tea. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, not waiting for a response before snatching the bag from her hands. Kyle ambled over slowly, smirking as Rick sifted through the harmless contents like he was looking for a grenade. "Looks like we got ourselves a little graffiti artist," Rick muttered. Amora frowned, calmly replying, "Sir, I'm just going home. I was sketching by the riverbank. That's all." But Rick wasn't listening. He said she looked nervous and was probably hiding something. When she refused to unlock her phone, the situation escalated. She was told she was resisting, and within minutes, Rick had her cuffed and pressed against the hood of the car, her sketchbook pages fluttering away in the breeze. The few bystanders at the gas station stared, some recording half-heartedly, but no one interfered. "You're making a big mistake," Amora said, her voice shaking but controlled. "My dad's in special forces. He's going to find me." Kyle chuckled. Rick burst out laughing. "Oh no, we arrested the president's daughter. Should I salute you now or later, Private Brooks?" Amora didn't say another word. She sat in the back of the cruiser with her eyes closed, whispering something under her breath. When they arrived at the station, they booked her for obstruction and trespassing, charges they knew would never stick. The desk sergeant looked skeptical but didn't question it. After all, Rick had a reputation for being thorough, even if that meant stretching the truth. Amora was placed in a holding cell, her wrists sore, lips pressed together, eyes staring straight ahead. Meanwhile, Rick boasted about the arrest in the break room, showing off Amora's confiscated sketchbook like a trophy. She really played the "my dad is a badass" card. Hilarious. Kyle added, "She even said he was special forces." As if. The room filled with laughter. Nobody noticed that Sergeant Lang, the older quiet officer by the back lockers, had stopped mid-sip of his coffee, eyes narrowing. Lang didn't say a word. He simply stepped outside, pulled out an old flip phone, and made a single call. Back in the cell, Amora sat motionless. She knew something her arresting officers didn't, that her father had installed a small emergency beacon in the base of her bracelet. And the moment Rick had tightened those handcuffs, she'd pressed it against the seat of the cruiser until it vibrated twice. Signal sent. Across the state, 104 miles away, Master Sergeant Elijah Brooks was in the middle of teaching a tactical operations course to a room full of soldiers when his watch vibrated. He glanced at it, read the encrypted message that flashed for 2 seconds, and then calmly said, "I need to cut the lesson short. Family emergency." He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just walked out, a duffel bag in one hand, silent as a shadow. At the Crescent Hill station, Rick bragged loudly about how scared Amora looked and how she'd definitely learned her place. He didn't know that within 2 hours, he'd be the one staring into the eyes of a ghost from a war zone, the kind of man who could take apart a room with a spoon. And this ghost wasn't coming to talk. Long before the flashing red and blue lights, the handcuffs, and the steel cell, Amora Brooks lived by a code etched into her by a father who had spent decades moving in the shadows of global conflict. Elijah Brooks wasn't just in Special Forces, he was Special Forces, legendary among those who wore the uniform, nearly invisible to the civilians he protected. A man forged in classified missions and silent corridors, he raised his daughter in a world where discipline was love, silence was strength, and awareness was survival. From the moment Amora could walk, she understood structure. She made her bed like a barracks cot. She folded her laundry with military precision. She memorized maps for fun and could assemble a broken-down bike faster than most grown men. Her father never shouted, never hit, never had to. His voice carried the gravity of someone who had stared down death in 3 continents and still remembered to bring home her favorite cinnamon rolls every Friday. They lived in a modest but fortified home on the outskirts of their small southern town. The neighbors thought Elijah was a quiet widower who worked in defense and homeschooled his daughter because she was a little different. And Amora was different. While other kids were on TikTok, she was sketching architectural layouts, memorizing Morse code, and reading declassified mission reports her dad had redacted himself. She wasn't a soldier, but she was forged like one. Still, Elijah let her have softness too. He taught her poetry, played jazz records during dinner, and spent hours helping her paint the mural on her bedroom wall, which depicted a soaring falcon over stormy waters. "Always rise above," he'd said, brushing the final feather onto the wing. No matter how rough the skies. But for all his preparation, Elijah knew he couldn't shield her from the world outside their home. As Amora grew older, their town grew smaller. Teachers began underestimating her. Store clerks followed her. One neighbor asked Elijah if Amora was adopted. Elijah had seen villages burned to the ground over less. But he didn't retaliate. He observed, watched, took note. And every night, he sat beside Amora and told her one truth above all: you do not raise your voice in a world that expects you to scream. You hold your ground, and when the time comes, you let them see who you are. That time came sooner than either of them expected. 2 weeks before the arrest, Amora had applied for a spot in a statewide young engineers competition. She'd submitted her original design for a sustainable emergency shelter, built from salvaged military-grade scrap and collapsible tubing. Her entry was initially shortlisted but then quietly removed with no explanation. A teacher later confessed in whispers that some parents didn't like the idea of her winning. Elijah didn't protest. He just nodded and asked Amora if she wanted to do a better version for herself. She did. They built a scaled model in their garage, complete with solar panels and collapsible insulation. Amora took it to the riverbanks to sketch the environment and calculate potential placements. That's where Officer Rick found her. She wasn't vandalizing. She wasn't loitering. She was planning a future. What the officer interpreted as suspicious was actually Amora running simulations in her notebook. What he saw as defiance was a young girl conditioned to remain composed under pressure. And what he mistook for a lie, her father's military background, was in fact a sleeping storm. Amora's calm in that holding cell wasn't an act. It was everything she had been raised to embody, a readiness, a stillness that masked calculation. She knew the timer had started the moment her bracelet activated, and she trusted her father to do what he always did, arrive without warning and change the rules of the game. But even with all that strength behind her, Amora was still 16. As she sat on the cold bench, knees drawn up, she thought not of retaliation or revenge, but of the mural on her bedroom wall. She wondered if the falcon would still rise through the storm or if this time, the wind would be too strong. She thought of her mother, whose picture Elijah kept on the fireplace mantel, an army medic who had died overseas when Amora was just a toddler. Her father had never spoken of the details, only saying, "She flew first, so we'd know how." That legacy weighed on Amora now like invisible armor. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She breathed deeply, aligning her heartbeat with her thoughts, one of the many grounding techniques her father had taught her. Back at home, the house was silent. A lamp still glowed in the living room, casting soft light on Elijah's framed medals and the dog tags he never wore but always kept within reach. The front door was locked, the cameras were on, and the perimeter sensors were armed. Amora's sketchbook, the one she used at the riverbank, had her tracking notes tucked inside the back cover. It was all designed that way. Every pencil mark, every border scribble, was part of the fallback protocol she and her father had created, just in case. Elijah had trained her not because he wanted her to be afraid, but because he knew that someday, the world would forget who she was. And when that happened, she'd have to remind them. Now, that day had come. And as the station lights buzzed overhead and laughter echoed from the far end of the hallway, Amora sat still, waiting not for rescue, but for reckoning. The station air was stale, dense with arrogance and microwave burrito fumes, a place where overconfidence wore a badge and routine injustice passed for paperwork. Officer Rick Granger leaned back in his chair, one boot on the desk, flipping through Amora's sketchbook like it was a comic strip. Kyle Denton was mid-rant about how these kids today think they're above the law, tossing in lazy quips between bites of stale pretzels. The desk sergeant, Harold Bex, glanced up now and then but didn't question a thing. Crescent Hill had always run on an unspoken code. If it looks quiet, then it must be right. But not today. Because today, the girl in cell 3 wasn't like the others they'd shoved through the system. Today, the silence wasn't ignorance, it was a countdown. Amora sat completely still, her eyes unfocused, her breathing measured. She wasn't praying or panicking. She was calculating. Her wrists ached from the cuffs, but she'd angled them subtly, just enough to ease circulation without drawing attention. She'd replayed every interaction since her arrest, the questions, the tone, the smirks. The way Rick laughed in her face when she mentioned her father. That laugh kept echoing, not because it hurt her feelings, but because she knew it was the last laugh he'd have for a very long time. The station's security camera light blinked overhead, casting a strobe of red across her face, like a warning light on the dash of a doomed vehicle. No one in that building recognized what they had just triggered. Not the man behind the booking desk, not the rookie sipping his energy drink near the lockers, and especially not Rick, who was now pantomiming a dramatic Special Forces rescue to Kyle, complete with explosion sound effects and bad kung fu kicks. Over 100 miles away, Elijah Brooks changed into civilian clothes at a gas station restroom. He removed his tactical ID, stashed it inside a hidden panel in his truck, and checked the holster in his duffel, legal, locked, and registered. But it wasn't the weapon that would shake Crescent Hill. It was him. His training had taught him how to blend into any environment, from war-torn alleys to manicured suburbs. He could vanish in a crowd, memorize an entire building's layout in 30 seconds, and hear lies in a man's breath pattern. What the cops didn't understand was that when Amora said her father would come, she wasn't making a threat, she was citing protocol. Elijah didn't scream down phone lines or demand supervisors. He came in person, because that's what men like him did when the chain of command failed. They became the chain of command. Back at the station, Lang, the older officer who'd quietly stepped out earlier, returned without a word. He gave no hint that he'd made a call. He walked past Rick and Kyle, who didn't notice the slight tension in his jaw or the way his fingers twitched near his belt. Lang had seen one too many arrogant busts in this place, and while he'd stayed quiet for too long, something about Amora's demeanor haunted him. Not fear, not rebellion, just readiness. The girl in the cell was not what Rick said she was. Lang had buried friends with that same quiet calm in their eyes before their final missions. He didn't know Elijah Brooks by name yet, but something in his gut screamed that whoever raised that girl was not the type to let injustice go unanswered. Amora heard the shift in footfalls first, boots softer, heavier, deliberate. Her father had taught her to identify people by their steps. Rick dragged his feet. Kyle bounced when he walked. But this was weight plus purpose. Somewhere beyond the cell walls, Elijah had entered the building. She straightened slightly but didn't rise. She didn't need to. The storm had arrived. Elijah walked into the lobby, nodded politely at the receptionist, and asked to speak with whoever was in charge. His tone was courteous but clipped. His eyes scanned every corner, every camera, every exit. When Bex met him at the door and asked who he was, Elijah simply handed over a card. It had no department, no phone number, just a seal and the initials DOD Clearance Level 7. Bex blinked, suddenly unsure of everything he thought he knew. "What's this about?" he asked. Elijah looked at him and replied calmly, "I'm here for my daughter." In the back, The mood shifted like a barometric pressure drop before a tornado. Lang stood up. Kyle frowned. Rick scoffed and said, "Oh, look, G.I. Joe's here. He probably thinks this is some Jason Bourne mission." No one laughed this time. Amora was already watching the security feed in the hallway monitor. Elijah's stance, his posture, his silence. She exhaled slowly. The trap had been sprung. Rick finally got up to meet Elijah, still puffed up like a rooster in a mirror. "Sir, we're handling a case here," he said with a mocking grin. "If you're her dad, maybe teach her some manners." Elijah didn't blink. He didn't shout. He didn't touch his holster. Instead, he leaned slightly forward and said, in a voice that dropped the room's temperature, "You laid hands on my child. You mocked her warning. Now you'll explain that to me, or someone with more stars on their shoulder." Rick stammered. Kyle went pale. Lang took a step back. Bex called someone, no one knows who. The room wasn't loud anymore. It was suffocating with tension. Elijah handed over a flash drive, labeled with an encrypted DOD seal. "This contains her biometric bracelet log, real-time GPS, and audio from the last 6 hours. You can review the part where she was detained illegally or wait for internal affairs to explain it to you with legal counsel present." Rick's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Elijah didn't wait for permission. He walked straight past him, every stride erasing their illusion of authority. He stopped only when he reached the holding cell. Amora stood up. He looked at her and gave the slightest nod. She nodded back. She was okay. But he wasn't. What happened next didn't involve broken bones or lawsuits, yet. Elijah knew the deeper war would be fought differently. His presence was a message. You don't get to hide behind silence anymore. As he stood there with his daughter, the station felt less like a place of law and more like a crime scene waiting to be processed. For most people, a police station is a place of tension, with its clattering keyboards, muffled radios, and the occasional burst of scolding from behind frosted glass. But when Elijah Brooks walked through those front doors, the atmosphere didn't spike, it collapsed inward. His presence didn't trigger chaos. It summoned silence. True silence. The kind that suffocates sound before it's even born. He stepped through the lobby like it was a battlefield perimeter, scanning every wall, every shadow, every idle hand resting too close to a holster. Not because he feared a threat, but because he needed only one excuse to act. And those who'd made a mockery of his daughter's dignity were now in his scope. Elijah didn't wear a uniform, didn't flash credentials, didn't even raise his voice. But everyone, receptionists, rookies, sergeants, felt the weight of something unspoken pressing down on their lungs as he moved. Every instinct, even in those who'd never seen combat, screamed the same thing: predator. Rick Granger had swaggered through this building like a wolf his entire career, barking orders, flexing his authority, twisting small incidents into full-blown arrests for the thrill of it. But now, face to face with Elijah's emotionless gaze, he looked like a child in a costume he didn't earn. The veneer cracked first in his voice, which came out higher than usual. "We've already processed her," he said, trying to lean back into dominance. "You can take it up with the county if you've got an issue." Elijah didn't blink. He didn't correct him. He simply took another step forward, slow and deliberate. "You will open that cell," he said quietly, "and you will apologize to my daughter." Rick scoffed. "Or what? You'll throw a tantrum." Behind them, Kyle shifted nervously. Lang, arms crossed, said nothing but narrowed his eyes like a man watching a match drop into dry grass. What no one realized was that Elijah wasn't here to threaten anyone. He was here to observe and document. A small recording device clipped beneath his jacket button had already captured every second since entry. But he had no intention of waiting for the legal system to catch up to what he already knew. He walked right past Rick, who instinctively reached for his belt, not for his gun, but for the handcuffs, unsure why. That subtle twitch didn't go unnoticed. Elijah turned, just slightly, and said, "That movement. You try it again, and you won't remember drawing breath." Rick froze, not because of the words, but because of the stillness behind them. Amora had once said her father could kill a man with a pencil. That wasn't a myth. It was an after-action report in a classified dossier Elijah had never even read himself. Down the hallway, the cell block buzzed with fluorescence and stagnant air. Amora sat on the bench, perfectly upright, as if she'd sensed every step her father had taken through the building. The steel door clanged open, not with urgency, but like the shifting of tectonic plates. She looked up. Elijah stood there, shoulders squared, his eyes locking onto hers not with panic or pity, but precision. "Stand up," he said. She did. "You okay?" She nodded once. He nodded back. That exchange, barely audible, had more substance than an entire courtroom transcript. He didn't need to say anything else. She was safe now. That was the mission. Behind them, Rick had finally summoned his courage, storming into the corridor with a clipboard, yelling something about procedure and unauthorized access. Elijah turned around and stepped between Rick and his daughter. "You assaulted a minor," he said with clinical detachment. "You mocked a lawful warning. You denied her medical evaluation. And you filmed her without parental consent." Rick waved the clipboard like a shield. "She was being difficult. We had probable cause." Elijah leaned closer, his voice lower than ever. "The only thing you have now is about 4 hours left before federal oversight locks this entire station down. Walk away." For a second, Rick looked ready to explode. But then Lang stepped forward. Not beside Rick, beside Elijah. "His right," Lang said. "Let it go." Rick stared at him, betrayal blooming in his eyes. "What the hell are you doing?" Lang didn't waver. "Keeping this place from going under." It was then that the first phone call came in, from the district office, referencing a report sent from Elijah's flash drive. 20 minutes later, a second call arrived, from the state's Internal Affairs Division. It wasn't just about Amora. It was about patterns. Unlawful detainments. Lost bodycam footage. Mysterious disappearances from records. Rick's chest heaved. Kyle sat down, pale. Bex rubbed his temples. Elijah turned to Amora. "We're going." No one stopped them. Not one hand reached for a badge, not one word protested. The station had become a ghost town before the dead arrived. Outside, the wind picked up. Elijah walked her out calmly, no rush, no drama. Because when you walk like you've earned every inch of ground, the world steps aside. But inside the building, the silence turned to rot. Officers who had once laughed now whispered. Lang walked into the locker room, opened his drawer, and stared at his badge. Maybe it was finally time to say something. Maybe he'd waited too long already. Rick didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the day. His ego had been carved out and left bleeding on the floor, and no amount of bluster could cauterize the wound. And Amora. She didn't look back, not even once. Because the lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about reminders. Reminders that even the quietest storm has a name, and hers was Amora Brooks. The ripple effect began with a single click. Somewhere deep within the state's Department of Internal Affairs, an analyst received a flagged file, unmarked sender, top priority designation, no subject line. The file contained surveillance footage, GPS logs, and an audio transcript from Crescent Hill's booking station. Within 20 minutes, a task force had been assembled. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, a federal team in unmarked vehicles was already en route, their silence more threatening than sirens. Inside the station, Rick's bravado had thinned into a twitching unease. Kyle stayed glued to his desk, eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. Lang had disappeared entirely, slipping away into the archives where the ghosts of bad arrests collected dust and shame. Amora was gone, but her presence haunted every inch of the building. The girl they had mocked turned out to be more than just a name. They had, unknowingly, locked up the daughter of one of the military's most decorated and classified operatives. And worse, they had triggered an investigation that was about to upend everything they thought was untouchable. The first agents arrived with no uniforms, no flashing lights, and no tolerance for posturing. They identified themselves only by initials and clearances, issuing a temporary lockdown of the entire precinct. Phones were seized, hard drives removed, backup servers copied on site. The officers were corralled into the conference room like students caught cheating mid-exam. Rick protested, demanding to speak to someone in charge, only to be told, without ceremony, "You are no longer in a position to make requests." Kyle tried to slink away, but two agents redirected him like a sheepdog herding a stray. Even Bex, who had worked in the station for over 20 years, sat stiffly in the corner, realizing that today would not end with a punch-out time card. In a nearby interrogation room, Elijah sat across from two internal affairs officials, not as a suspect, but as a witness. The drive he had submitted earlier was just the tip of a very ugly iceberg. What followed was a cascade of revelations. Bodycam footage, long deleted from department records, was still retrievable through Elijah's military encryption techniques. Audio from the booking room revealed racial slurs, deliberate escalation tactics, and multiple procedural violations. But the most damning evidence came from Lang, who stepped forward with an unredacted report from 6 months earlier detailing Rick's history of using excessive force against Black and Latino teens. The report had never reached county court. It had been buried, intentionally. Lang had tried to raise concerns before, but his warnings were always met with bureaucracy or outright threats. Seeing Elijah walk through the station, unshaken and resolute, had reignited something long dormant in him: conviction. More officers were named as the hours passed. A quiet clerk named Denise brought forward emails and paper trails showing falsified timestamps, backdated reports, and even blank incident forms that were filled in after arrests were made. It wasn't just misconduct, it was organized abuse. Elijah didn't gloat. He didn't even speak much. He watched. He listened. And when asked for a final statement by the internal affairs officers, he said only, "My daughter is strong, but she shouldn't have to be bulletproof to survive a walk home." That line was later quoted in national headlines. The media storm hit faster than anyone predicted. By morning, every major news outlet had a breaking story: Special Forces operative exposes small-town police corruption after daughter's arrest. Interviews with civil rights attorneys followed. Community leaders who had long suspected systemic bias finally had proof. Parents came forward with their own stories: kids harassed, detained, silenced. A local mother revealed her teenage son had been stopped and searched 3 times in 1 week by Rick and Kyle, with no cause. The mayor issued a statement that fell flat, offering concern but avoiding accountability. Protesters gathered outside the station. Some carried signs with Amora's name. Others carried the Constitution. Rick was suspended without pay pending further investigation, but he knew what that meant. His badge was already a relic. Kyle resigned before they could fire him. Bex took early retirement, citing stress. Lang, for the first time in years, walked into a press briefing and told the truth, not just about Rick, but about the culture of silence that had infected their halls like mold. Denise was promoted to a role where she could audit internal documents full-time. The precinct underwent a complete overhaul. But the damage was already done. Meanwhile, Amora stayed quiet. She declined interviews, refused invitations to speak at rallies. She returned to her sketching, this time designing a justice center that doubled as a community space for underserved youth. Her blueprint went viral online. Colleges called with offers. Scholarships arrived in envelopes she didn't open. Elijah kept them in a drawer until she was ready. His mission was complete, but the war was far from over. He'd shown the world what happens when power forgets its responsibility. And he had done it without violence, without vengeance, just presence. That, he believed, was the most powerful weapon of all. The storm didn't pass, it settled, like dust in the lungs of a town that had spent too many years breathing in its own rot. The precinct stood still behind cold concrete and faded blue paint, an empty fortress now stripped of its illusion of control. No arrests were being made that week. Patrol cars sat idle. The flag outside flew at half-mast, though no one had officially ordered it. Inside, the locker rooms were hollow and quiet. A single memo on the bulletin board read, "Mandatory ethics training, all personnel." But for most of the officers who remained, that felt like slapping gauze on a severed limb. Outside, cameras still buzzed as reporters filmed against the backdrop of protest banners. Most of the signs bore Amora's name. Some had Elijah's quote printed in bold: "She shouldn't have to be bulletproof to survive a walk home." Others asked the question Crescent Hill couldn't answer. How many didn't get a father to walk in? Rick Granger never returned to the station. His suspension turned permanent before the week was out. Internal Affairs officially closed their investigation with 5 terminations, 3 demotions, and 1 officer facing criminal charges for falsifying reports, Rick. His lawyer tried to paint him as overwhelmed, undertrained, and victimized by anti-police hysteria. But no jury bought that, not after the footage was played in full. The laughter, the smirks, the disregard. When the court sentenced him to 18 months in county jail, there was no applause, no celebration. Just silence. Amora didn't attend the trial. Elijah did, but he never looked at Rick. He simply stood outside the courthouse afterward, hands folded, eyes skyward, as if asking for a moment of peace in a world that kept making war with itself. Amora returned to school, but it wasn't the same. Some classmates looked at her like she was a hero. Others avoided her entirely. Teachers overcompensated, giving her praise she hadn't asked for, grading her work like it was fragile. She didn't want a parade. She wanted normalcy. But trauma doesn't walk away when the cameras do. At night, she sometimes found herself replaying the sound of the cell door slamming shut. In the quiet of her room, she imagined voices echoing with mockery and suspicion. Her father noticed the change. She stopped humming to herself when she drew. She didn't ask for jazz records anymore. She flinched at sudden knocks on the door. One evening, as Elijah stood in her doorway watching her sleep, he realized the irony. He had trained her to survive everything except after. And now, she was navigating a battlefield he couldn't clear for her. He tried to help in the only ways he knew. They resumed morning routines, stretching at dawn, laps around the block, silent breakfasts. He began teaching her defense techniques again, not because she needed them, but because they gave her back a piece of control. They built new sketches together. One was a memorial for victims of police violence. Another was a park design that subtly integrated emergency call stations disguised as art. Amora submitted that one to an architectural youth competition. She won first place. When the mayor's office asked her to accept a community service award, she declined. She said she didn't need a plaque for surviving. She needed the system to stop giving plaques for apologies. News cycles moved on. Another town. Another tragedy. But Crescent Hill was different now. The new police chief, a woman named Tash Ngata, was a former military investigator who didn't smile for cameras. She reopened every complaint from the last 10 years. Bodycams became mandatory, and every incoming officer went through implicit bias and trauma-informed response training. Lang stayed on staff as her second-in-command. When asked why he hadn't resigned like the others, he answered, "Because I finally have a reason to show up." And Denise, the clerk whose files had sparked the investigation, was promoted again. She created a department-wide database of arrest records, open to the public. It was a start. Elijah and Amora didn't talk much about what happened. Not because they were avoiding it, but because it lived in the spaces between everything they did. When he tucked her in at night, his hand lingered on the doorframe a second longer than it used to. When she hugged him, she gripped tighter. On the anniversary of her arrest, they didn't speak. They simply took a walk. Down the same path she had taken that day, past the riverbank, through the town square. People greeted them with a mix of shame and admiration. Elijah nodded politely. Amora kept her head high. Not proud. Just present. Back home, the mural in her room remained unfinished. The falcon's wings were still mid-stroke, caught between ascent and descent. One afternoon, without saying a word, Amora stood on a chair and picked up her brush. Elijah entered, paused, and watched as she completed the final line. Sharp, clean, rising toward the ceiling. "Always rise above," she whispered, the words trembling but steady. Her father stood beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. Not everything had healed. Not everything would. But the world now knew her name, and more importantly, they remembered it for the right reasons.